thoughts arising?
And what I should probably say, by the way, is that I don't think we particularly need to discuss whether what I've said is valid or not. I mean, it might just be the case that some of the things I've said inspire thoughts and comments. It's not about you need to tell me, that's not why I'm here. It's just really, you know, let's have a discussion.
Yep. Yes, please.
I just wanted to make sure that I understand one of your last comments about some of the absences in political ecology is connecting political ecology with anti-globalization movement or anti-capitalism movement. Is that correct? Is that what you said? Or?
Yes, in certain contributions, and I've pointed to 3, there is an interesting absence in recognition of and discussion of a set of, and it's not just outside the university, by the way, but a set of movements that have interesting ideas about alternative futures and are hopeful that those futures can be somehow created.
And political ecology does not write about those. Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that there are certain strands in contemporary Marxist thinking that takes the future climate change and the scale of future climate change seriously, that strangely don't want to entertain the possibility that that future can be go in several different ways. There's a certain fatality about it, and I'm curious as to why that is. Fatalism, sorry, not fatality. Fatalism.
With respect to Dan Book's work, which I don't know, but with this argument that capitalism will continue working no matter what because it finds opportunities to thrive even under destruction. For me, that, and I'm not trained in the Marxist line of thinking, but I've read your work, I've read other people's work. But for me, what always is difficult for me to understand is the exact definition of capitalism. The idea of capital searching for capital or money searching for money seems to me so broad that, of course, it seems that under a variety of scenarios it might continue happening. But I don't understand when it's going to be the distinguishing line, when it's going to be still money searching for money, but perhaps in a very confined scale.
Yeah.
It will no longer be capitalism, it will be something new, no?
Yeah.
So I think also whether capitalism will continue depends on how you define capitalism, how broad you define and how narrow you define.
Absolutely agreed. Except what I would say to that is that the kind of Marxists that I've been mentioning today would be very clear that about their definition of capitalism. It's one that I would certainly agree with. I mean, whatever word you want to use, but what they're talking about, you know, is a system that is predicated on people having to sell their ability to work in order to live. Competition between firms which spurs endless technical innovation, and finally the search for profit as the ultimate goal of production. Accumulation for accumulation's sake, to use the famous phrase from Marx. So if you can eliminate all those things, then you don't have capitalism. You might have something else that's not very nice, but you don't have capitalism. And the world would surely be different in a number of extremely non-trivial ways. So, I mean, so that's the kind of understanding of capitalism that these people are talking about. But I do take your point. You know, there are elements of, I mean, this has always been the case. There are elements of any mode of production that will always somehow live on into a different mode of production because, you know, there aren't historical breaks. You don't have sharp endings. You know, whatever people say, life just doesn't seem to work that way.
Yeah.
You've mentioned that future climate change poses to us the question of linking the future with present in innovative ways. And I feel that there is an element of speculation in that. You are calling for speculative theories, so to speak. I'm not sure that the word is exact, but yeah, there is an element of speculation in that. And what I'm wondering is, and trying to link with your final remark on the causes of the unpolitical imaginary, is would that require changing academic practice as well, the way that we write and the way we construct theory? And as a result, would that require changing university as an institution, especially in the Anglo-Saxon world where what is valued is a product that can be evaluated upon certain criteria, well defined, and so on and so forth. And how we do it, I mean, that would be a really broad question, how we go on doing that, or if any suggestions on it.
Yeah, okay. So kind of two aspects to that. So in respect to the first one about future climate change potentially changing the whole way we think and act in the present. I've been thinking about this a lot. Some of you may disagree, but if you believe the claims made by the likes of Kevin Anderson and Alice Bowes, I mean, I was really shocked, I must say. You know, when I first heard Kevin Anderson talk about 4 degrees C, you know, I couldn't stop thinking about it for about 3 weeks. You know, and it made me think, how complacent have I been? You know, where's my head been? You know, why have I not really paid attention to this? You know, after all, I'm a geographer, I'm supposed to be interested in these things in a very deep way. But so if you take those claims seriously, one of the things that really interests me is how can we somehow consider a future that we know is going to be changed considerably, but we don't know the fine details of it. How can we take that seriously now? How can we take 40 years, 50 years, 60 years down the line seriously now? We have to, because we're already making that future right now. Our fathers and grandfathers, and, you know, they all helped to make that future, and they're dead. So all that's programmed in. That's cumulative emissions. So how do we do that? And the reason in the presentation I said this is unprecedented is because I can't think of any generation in history that has been obliged to think ahead, take the future so seriously because of biophysical change. You know, we think in terms of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years, but we've never had powerful reason to think, actually, we need to think now about 50, 60, 70, 80, 300 years ahead. I mean, this is mind-blowing, actually. So, you can't see it, you can't touch it, you can't feel it yet, but somehow you have to take it seriously and work with it in the present. And I don't really know how you do that. And I'm scratching my head all the time now to think about what does that do to analysis and to theory. So I can recognise the challenge, but I don't really have a sense of what the answer might be to that. Your second part of your question on what it does to academic work. Yeah. I made the point at the end that I love what I do. I'm sure Gavin knows what he does. And I really value the space and time that I get to think, to study, to be considered and careful in what I try to be, in what I say and what I write. On the other hand, I'm acutely aware that the way that certainly British universities are configured can make it very challenging to do things in a different way. So it can make it very challenging to not write books and publish journal articles and show up to class on time and do all the very conventional sort of treadmill-y things that we do. And how do you change that? Well, you change that with great difficulty, structurally, or if you try to do things differently individually, then there is a risk involved with that around career progression and all the rest of it. And we know people whose careers have suffered mightily, you know, in all sorts of different ways because they wanted to be different. I think what I would favour is a university system that was less obsessed with the production of knowledge for knowledge's sake. Some people disagree with me on this, but I actually welcome the fact that the British government is now trying to value the impact of our research in the wider society. I don't necessarily agree with the way it's being measured, but I think to institutionally support that is a valuable thing because it allows people like me and Gavin and the other people who've been involved in delivering these seminars to feel that it's actually okay to do what many of us want to do anyway, which is to get out of rooms like this and be elsewhere, talking to different people. So,
thank you. Thanks. Just a brief observation on that. Your point about considering time.
yeah,
There are discussants yesterday from the climate activist groups. Their response to that, what happens when we try to consider time, is that one often gets the argument that there is no time, and that that's what shuts down effectively debate about the form of the politics.
Yeah.
That's their response to that. Whereas you seem to be suggesting that actually it's not about we don't have time, it's more about how do we consider futurity, how do we get our heads around those much longer periods of impacts and the implications of activity today. I mean,
yeah. So the idea that there is not enough time is in a sense is absurd. I mean, relative to what? Of course, there's not enough time. Of course, there's not enough time, and bad things will happen because there's not enough time. But there is enough time in that we can make decisions in the here and now that will change those futures in very meaningful ways. The problem is we don't know how, because we're not there, we're here. That's the gamble.
let's take some more questions. Hugo, yes.
Yes, and in the same question, who can act or who have to act about climate change? Our research, many of the research in political ecology are about local communities, and we know that the local communities don't have enough power to defend their own land. And basically, we're going to talk about the working class. So, who have to protect or take action now? The state, the large international companies, the civil society, the environmentalists. I totally agree with you, but at this moment, probably because we are not thinking about the future now, we don't know who will be or who could be the people that can take some action.
Shall we get some more ideas off the table so people can chip in? Giacomo.
I want to reinforce the point on the anti-globalization movement, because I think, for example, yesterday we were thinking about, after the discussion with the climate change activists, that even if they were trying to say to us that they escaped the apocalypse claim, they are getting it, because what they are working on is exactly what the agenda of climate change is imposing. No? So they are investing their energy, let's say, not on urban, local, concrete problems of everyday life, but on something that is put on agenda by these climate change discourses. So, what is your take? Because I think partially these people are part of, or were part of, anti-globalization movement. So they moved to this topic because now is the really important topic to stay in the world, in the movement. So I don't think that it's just a matter of some intellectual. I mean, we also, as activists or people part of anti-globalization, we fall down in this trap, let's say. And then the second point that I agree, for example, my criticism also to the answer of Eric to the apocalypse and this catastrophic narrative is they always suppose that all the anthropology respond to the same catastrophism in the same way. And this is in some ways unpolitical imaginative what is opening up. What is your take on this? I mean, because this idea that we all react in the same way to an apocalypse is also, I think, is open up a political imaginary of possibilities in different ways.
Should we get a few other ideas? Yeah, thanks for that. Other thoughts, comments? Isaac?
Well, it was quite provocative and in a way challenging. You talk about theory and how years of our time we spend going through the education system, and obviously we are a product of that system. So I was just wondering, how do we escape that trap? Because obviously our thinking has been shaped over time and all kinds of subjects or information that we've been exposed to. And now engaging with our way and trying to understand how the theories that we create and how that impacts or restricts the way we look at the world. how can we escape that trap? And secondly, in a very, obviously because I know you've been engaging a lot with the subject on nature, but you've tackled it just in passing today about reading on from Maria's and Eric's presentation and your thoughts about nature and how obviously the concept of nature and the concept around that, like nature is not natural. It's something that's obviously produced and it's a social, natural in a way. But it's quite unsettling when I read some of the work that comes from the political ecology and we still use this concept of nature. So I was just wondering, what are your thoughts about this notion of nature? Do you think it's a word that has to be banished or that has to be thrown out of the window, or there's still some useful way we can use it or invent with it, or we need something completely different to refer to something that's obviously not natural? So that's just my side question in a way.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Do you want to pick up any of those?
Yeah. Oh god, this could go horribly wrong. There's a lot there, wasn't there?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, this thing about agents of change, which you also touched upon, agents of change who, you know, who's trying to change the world. You know, one interpretation of why the likes of Dan and Nathan and Eric are, according to my reading, so kind of glum or kind of limited in their horizons is because, you might say, objectively speaking, there is not much of an organised force out there that can actually do anything. And certainly if you look at West European countries, not all of them, I mean Greece is obviously having a hell of a time. One of the great co-opters of dissent is wealth. You know, we're in a recession in this country, and yet actually, look around you, you know, a lot of people doing pretty good. Not everyone, a lot of people doing pretty good. So you could actually completely reverse what I've tried to say today and argue that actually this rather unpolitical, weakly political sense of what's possible simply reflects the fact that in very large pockets of the world, particularly the wealthiest countries in the world, there is virtually no serious political opposition. Now that's really depressing. And part of me sort of believes that. Part of me believes that. Or to rephrase it, there's lots of political dissent, but it's fragmented and it's dispersed and it's very small scale. Like the transition times movement in the UK, which is extremely worthy. But, you know, it's sort of in the interstices, it's not really changing government decision making, it's not changing corporate practice particularly. In fact, in many ways, it's having to cozy up to big corporates to deliver the changes that it'd like to see. So, yeah. Now that may not be the case in 15, 20, 25 years. You know, the beauty of history is it's about change, particularly in the capitalist world. So I'm always optimistic that somehow things can improve. I won't say much more on opposition than that. Can you just remind me the second part of your question, please? Because you said two things.
The second part is the hypothesis that to a catastrophic narrative.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I mean,
always the same answer to this catastrophic narrative.
Yeah.
And I think it's completely wrong. So
Yeah.
you cannot see different reaction to the catastrophes.
Yeah, well, as with any universal claim, it can cut in two ways. It can either be incredibly useful, well, useful for who, and disempowering, or disempowering for others, or very empowering for some and disempowering for still others. So, I mean, Eric's point is that the language of a blanket catastrophe is a great pacifier. You know, if you scare people, and you say, actually, but we need to do something now, this is his argument, I'm not saying I agree, then, you know, it's easier to say, well, we need to do this, this and this, and people go, okay, yeah, we'll do that. But you're absolutely right that that's not going to play out equally everywhere on the planet. And Mike Hume, in a book called Why We Disagree About Climate Change, and he's a scientist, Mike Hume, but he's very critical of these universalising discourses, including the discourse of science itself. You know, these are the global emissions, this is the average temperature increase, there will be big changes everywhere. He's very critical of that. And he makes the point that actually what climate change means will have to be embedded in different local histories, different traditions and different circumstances, and people have to sort of work with the idea in their own ways. And in some places it's going to be an idea that hopefully forces major changes in the way in which we live our lives. In other places it will be accommodated in a less dramatic fashion. So I think, as with all these universal claims, you have to just look at who's making them and, you know, what are their purposes and ends. And they're not all nefarious, of course, in some cases.
So, I'm sorry, other thoughts?
There was, yes, right. Yeah, you asked about nature. Well, just remind me the first, don't have to say the whole thing again, just quickly remind the first part of your comment.
Yeah, just this track, introducing theory.
That's right, yeah, okay. Yeah, I mean, where does theory get done? Where does sort of, quote, big analysis get performed these days? I would suggest mostly in universities. Not exclusively, but mostly in universities. It always interests me that on the occasions I meet activists, it's usually when they've come into the university because they want some theory. So it offers something important, but it's often offered in these kind of institutions, these kind of spaces. So you ask, can we change ourselves? Because we're products, inevitably we're products to some extent of the environments in which we are raised and the ones that we inhabit. You can do it individually, and I made the comment before about taking risks. Now that, you've got to be brave. If I just end this PowerPoint, I can do that. The thing is going on.
It's the right click.
How is it? It's just
It's
gone
frozen.
Anyway, I'll carry talking. If you can get the, let's get the first slide going here. That end show. I'll just go back to the first slide, and this very nice quotation from Jeff Mann, which was one of my two epigrams.
From beginning.
From beginning. Where's that gone?
Far
Oh yeah. Okay. So here's Jeff Mann. So you can check this on an individual level, okay? And it's a bit scary. So he says Marx makes one acutely aware of the need for action so radical it's quite frightening. To take him seriously as a person of the left is to experience the knowledge that one's world, especially if one is among the more fortunate, does not match one's moral claims, and the only way to make it do so would be to take risks and attempt the kind of change that it's most likely to require throwing it all away. This is very unsettling, and we're not unreasonably attempted to turn instead to something that allows us to contemplate the chasm between the is and the ought without demanding the same kind of fear and trembling. But there's a different way, and this is the way that academics are actually not very good at achieving at the moment, which is to do something collectively, so that individuals don't have to bear all the risk of doing things differently. And that is about organising the way in which universities produce knowledge, the norms against which we are judged, how we are valued. And that really, at the end of the day, has to involve structural change. It has to be a collective enterprise. So if you step out, it's not because you yourself have been unbelievably brave, admirable though that is, it's because actually the environment around you permits it because you've organised to create that environment. And I used to be a member of what used to be one of the two major unions that represent British academics, and we've just got Pat's older than me, but we've got a very bad history in this country of organising politically. We're very supine in the face of central government policymakers, and that's been true for a really long time. Sorry, that's a bit down. On the nature question, I don't like yes-no answers, so I'm not going to say the language of nature is useless and we should get rid of it. I actually think it can serve some very useful purposes, and actually it's one of the arguments I make in my book, Making Sense of Nature, that we don't necessarily have to abandon the language of nature, the natural, etc., etc. However, in a climate change world, it's very clear that nature in the stereotypical sense of the untouched simply won't exist, and you have to be a bit of a fool not to spot that. So as I'm sure you recognise, some of the more interesting debates about how we engage with the non-human world do dispense with the concept of nature altogether. For example, I've been reading a book by Emma Maris, who's based in Seattle, I think, called Rambunctious Nature. And it's about, and I mentioned conservation biology in this presentation, it's about forms of nature conservation that have no truck with the idea of natural species, natural ecosystems, that actually revel in the entanglement between us, plants, insects, animals, and kind of work with that mess. And that's quite inspiring. Of course, though, if you're a hardcore conservation biologist who doesn't want nature to be destroyed, you recoil in horror because you've got no baseline against which to judge what's good and bad ecological practice.
When you were speaking and you were making the point about what theory should be, and you drew this distinction between theory as we should be builders rather than excavators, and Harvey's idea of builders and excavators, and theory as being the roles of the insurgent architect, is the phrase you used. And I'm thinking about what Entitle tries to do, and to bring together theory and practice. I think that might be useful for us as a group to kind of reflect on, well, what role we as propagators of theory in some way, and people are engaged in different contexts with practice, what we imagine our theoretical practices to be. What are we trying to achieve? I wonder if people have thoughts on that based on our own practical experience. How do we imagine theory? Does it fit this model of the insurgent architect?
And can I just say on that, one of the contexts for me making that point is that in my education, which is very interdisciplinary, but dominated by social science readings and some humanities stuff, there is a massive focus on explanation and analysis, and a much smaller focus on proposing, quote, feasible alternatives. I don't know why that is. I don't know what it is about members of certainly the social science communities that I've encountered that makes them reticent to venture substantive comments about making things different and better. And I think that's a big feature of the kind of Marxism that I've kind of bathed myself in for the last 25 years. Maybe in early generations there was much more focus on the future, socialism, change. Pat certainly knows that much better than I do. But in the recent period, I think much less so.
And am I right in thinking then, from your comments about Kevin Anderson and Alice Bowe's piece, the kind of the normative form of science, do you see that as is that branch of scientific inquiry is doing something that critical social sciences is backing away from, but it's actually making claims on what ought to happen in a way that perhaps critical social science should be doing? Is that what you see going on there?
And I think there is quite a bit of critical social science that's doing it, but there could be an awful lot more. So I mentioned Bruno Latour in 2004. Again, some of you may have seen this and read it. Most of you probably haven't. Why Critiquers Run Out of Steam, something like that was the title of the piece. I think it was in Critical Inquiry in the journal. I'm not sure. I mean, Latour is very guilty of making overdrawn distinctions between things, and I've done it a bit today. He uses them as heuristics to make arguments. But one of the claims that he makes is that for far too long, and he implicates himself in this, social scientists have been obsessed with debunking, revealing, explaining. Why don't they try to assemble, to suggest the new, to bring that new into being as part of some wider kind of project? So I do think it's there. I think there's a lot of really interesting literature that's proposing alternatives. I mean, you and I are geographers. Actually, there's very little of it in geography, I must say, very little. And probably even in places like sociology, which I also read into quite heavily.
We had an interesting example. Thinking of this idea about building and assembling, and just thinking of some of the presentations we heard yesterday. So, Marty. So thinking about assembling something new, and in the case that you described of northern Peru and the Amazon, assembling something new had a strong methodological component. It's about producing new forms of data that allow claims to be made, that produce change, kind of the negotiated outcomes over who can say what's happening around environmental contamination in the Amazon. So that assembly role is not necessarily about new concepts. It can be very much about very practical interventions that produce sets of data, that produce new knowledge that allow people to contest claims.
Yeah.
So there's some I was just thinking there's some very concrete ways in which that acts of assembling something new are already taking place in the sorts of work that we're doing as a group.
Yeah.
Other thoughts? Yes, Irina.
But since we are talking about case studies, and many of these case studies in all over the world are actually insurgent people, right? I mean, we can be an intermediary between academia and what's called marginal knowledge or subaltern knowledge or whatever, marginalized knowledge. And I think that in itself is an ensemble because you have a different language, you have different way of thinking, different way of life that are being forgotten or marginalized. So in that sense, it's a creative work of an academic person only to make that knowledge heard, visible, and so on, right?
Yeah.
But for that, I think maybe we should not ask the question who. I mean, ever since Foucault, I mean, power is not, a center, it's capillary. So it's, just to accept these things that we all have somehow a power to make things circulate.
Right. Yeah, other observations? Okay. Yes, Isaac.
Just follow on from my earlier question, which you've already answered, I've always had this constant antagonism within myself, spending more time within the ivory towers, as it were, of the academic environment, and linking up the knowledge that we produce to practice. So this schism between academia and practice. And obviously, you want to be identified, in a certain way as an academic. You produce your work and you want to affiliate yourself with a certain niche of academic practice or theory, as it were. So how much do you reach out, and how does that actually affect relationships with? Because obviously you might have multiple identities as an academic, but at the same time you want to touch base with reality, but in some way that can affect the way you're accepted within a certain niche within your academic field. So how do you negotiate those multiple identities as an academic to be accepted within a particular niche that you want to be identified with, but at the same time you want your work to make impact on the ground? So obviously you've been in academia for quite a long time. How do you negotiate those multiple identities?
I just don't think there's a general answer to that question, and we could probably identify interesting examples that will give you very different answers to your question. I can give you a positive one if it's of any help. We've got a visitor here next week called Jane Wills from Queen Mary College, University of London, who also has kind of Marxism in her DNA, intellectual DNA, and what she's been able to do is align her research and the demands of her institution, publication, etc., with the political aspirations of individuals and communities that she's been interested in. And she's been doing activist research on the living wage in East London, including ensuring that our own university college, Queen Mary College, itself has now a living wage policy. So I'm not saying it was easy for her, but it was kind of seamless because she was able, without contradiction, to intervene in the situation that she was interested in and still use all that material to meet the kind of normal standards of academic life around publications, peer review, and all the rest of it. If you were here you are here next week. I mean, she's actually someone very good to talk to about how she achieved that. Was it luck? Was it just damn hard work? But it's obviously worked for her, and it's worked for the people who she's, and it's not just her, who she's sort of worked with and assisted and enabled to create something positive. So it's not just the campus, it's the wider East London area and its immigrants, and it's ensuring that major employers do offer, and they weren't, a living wage for the generally crappy jobs that those people have to do, like cleaning. you know, cleaning windows, sweeping floors, cleaning out toilets, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, great. Okay, so what I think we'll do now is bring this to a close. I'd like to thank Noel very much indeed